Elias stood before the heavy wooden doors of the council chamber in Jerusalem, smoothing the rough fabric of his tunic. The air in the hallway was cool, but sweat gathered at the base of his neck. He was not a man easily rattled. As a scholar of the law, he dealt in facts, in written statutes, and in the unyielding certainty of tradition. But the rumors swirling through the city streets like a desert wind had unsettled even the most stoic elders. They spoke of a man from the north, a carpenter turned rabbi, who was drawing crowds that rivaled the pilgrims at Passover. The doors opened. Elias stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the corners where the senior members of the Sanhedrin sat in silence. The high priest did not waste time with pleasantries. He leaned forward, his face obscured by the low light, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of authority. He told Elias that order was the foundation of their survival. He said that Rome watched them with the eyes of a hawk, waiting for any excuse to tighten its grip. A peasant stirring up the countryside with talk of a new kingdom was not just a religious annoyance, it was a political danger. Elias received his instructions clearly. He was not to arrest the man, not yet. He was to observe. He was to follow the dust trails of this teacher, listen to his words, and find the fracture in his logic. He was to find the heresy that would allow them to silence him legally. It was a mission of intellect, a hunt for a fatal flaw. Elias nodded, accepting the scroll that served as his warrant. He left Jerusalem before the sun reached its peak, traveling alone to avoid suspicion. History is often written by those in power, but the truth hides in the whispers of the crowd. Your support gives a voice to the stories they try to silence. Press like and subscribe to help us uncover what has been hidden for centuries. Stay with us, because the secret Elias is about to find is far more dangerous than a simple rebellion. His journey took him toward the villages surrounding the city, where the latest reports placed the traveling group. The road was hard, packed down by generations of travelers. Elias did not look at the hills or the sky. His mind was locked on the task. He needed to understand the appeal. Why would people leave their work, their homes, and their duties to follow a man with no credentials? He arrived at a small settlement just as the afternoon heat began to break. The atmosphere in the village was strange. It was not the usual quiet of daily labor. People were gathered in clusters, whispering, arguing, some weeping openly. Elias approached a well where a group of men stood. He asked them if the teacher from Nazareth had passed through. One of the men, a tanner with stained hands, nodded vigorously. He said Elias had missed him by only a few hours. Elias asked what the man had said that caused such a stir. The tanner looked at his companions, then back at Elias, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and wonder. He said the teacher told a story about a father and two sons. Elias pulled out his writing tablet, ready to record the sedition. He asked the man to repeat the story. The tanner began. He spoke of a younger son who demanded his share of the estate while his father was still breathing, an act of supreme disrespect. Elias noted this immediately. In their culture, such a request was equal to wishing the father dead. The tanner continued, describing how the boy took the money, fled to a distant land, and wasted it all on wild living until he was destitute, feeding pigs to survive. Elias sneered. Justice was simple. The boy had made his choice. The law demanded that he be cut off. But the tanner shook his head, his voice trembling. He said that was not how the story ended. The boy returned, hoping only to be a servant. But the father did not wait for an apology. The father did not demand repayment. The father saw him from a distance and ran. Elias stopped writing. He looked at the tanner sharply. He asked if he had heard correctly. A patriarch of a household never ran. It was undignified. It involved lifting one's robes, exposing one's legs, acting like a child or a servant. To run was to lose honor. The tanner insisted that was exactly what the teacher said. The father ran, embraced the boy covered in pig filth, and ordered a feast. He restored the son completely. Elias felt a cold anger rising in his chest. This was the danger. This teacher was upending the social order. If honor and shame meant nothing, if consequences could be erased by a sprint and a hug, then the law was meaningless. He asked about the older brother. Surely the story had a voice of reason. The tanner nodded. The older brother was angry. He refused to go into the feast. He told the father that he had slaved for years without a goat to celebrate with his friends, yet this rebel returns and gets the fattened calf. Elias felt a kinship with this older brother. Here was the man of law, the man of duty. He waited for the tanner to tell him how the father corrected the older son's attitude, or how the father admitted his mistake. But the tanner said the father merely pleaded with the older son to come inside, saying that they had to celebrate because the dead was alive again. Elias closed his tablet with a snap. He saw the trap. This teacher was painting the righteous as bitter and the rebellious as heroes. He was attacking the very idea of merit. Elias thanked the tanner abruptly and turned away. He needed to find this man. He needed to stand in the crowd and look him in the eye. This was not just a storyteller. This was an anarchist tearing at the fabric of their morality. Elias tightened his belt and began to walk north, following the fresh tracks of the crowd, his heart hardening with every step. The journey north to Galilee took days, but Elias moved with the relentless pace of a man possessed by duty. As he neared the great lake, the air grew heavier, humid and thick. The isolation of the road gave way to congestion. Travelers clogged the paths, not merchants or soldiers, but common people, the sick, the poor, the desperate. They moved like a single organism, drawn by a magnetic pull toward the water's edge. Elias pulled his hood forward to shadow his face. He did not want to be recognized as a scholar from Jerusalem. He wanted to be a ghost in the crowd. He reached the shoreline near Capernaum, where the press of bodies was suffocating. There were thousands of them. They pushed against the water, forcing the object of their attention to retreat. Elias saw him for the first time, the man from Nazareth. He did not look like a king. He wore common clothes. There was no halo, no army, no retinue of servants. He waded into the shallows and climbed into a small fishing boat. He asked the owner to push out a little from the land. It was a practical move, Elias realized, with a grudging respect. The water would carry his voice like a natural amphitheater, and the gap prevented the mob from crushing him. The crowd fell silent. The sound of the water lapping against the hull was the only noise. Elias positioned himself behind a group of fishermen, taking out his stylus. He was ready to record the insurrection. The teacher sat down in the boat and began to speak. He did not quote the great rabbis of the past. He did not cite the intricate precedents of the law. He pointed to a hillside visible in the distance, where a lone figure was walking across a field. He began to tell a story about a farmer going out to sow his seed. Elias listened, his stylus hovering over the wax. It was a simple agricultural image, something every person here had seen 1,000 times. The teacher described how the farmer scattered the seed broadly, almost carelessly. Some seed fell along the path. The ground was hard, packed down by many feet. The seed sat on the surface, exposed and vulnerable. Before it could settle, the birds came and ate it up. Elias watched the crowd. He saw a group of Pharisees near the front, their arms crossed, their faces set in stone. They were listening, but their minds were already made up. The words hit their ears and bounced off. Elias wrote down a quick note. The path represented the closed mind. He wondered if the teacher was mocking the religious leaders, calling them hard-hearted. It was a subtle insult, but undeniable. The teacher continued. Some seed fell on rocky places. There was a little soil, but deep down it was solid stone. The seed sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun rose, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Elias shifted his gaze to a young man standing near him. The boy was weeping, his hands raised, his face full of sudden, intense emotion. Elias had seen this before. Emotional responses that burned hot and fast but vanished as soon as life became difficult. He looked at the teacher in the boat. This man knew human nature. He was warning them that immediate joy was not the same as endurance. Elias felt a flicker of unease. The analysis was too sharp for a mere carpenter. Other seed fell among thorns, the teacher said. The thorns grew up and choked the plants. They produced no grain. Elias looked at a well-dressed merchant who was checking the position of the sun, likely worried about his business appointments. The worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, the desire for other things, these were the thorns. They strangled the truth before it could bear fruit. Elias paused. He thought of his own career, his ambition to sit on the high council, his need for the approval of the elders. Were these his thorns? He shook his head, dismissing the thought. He was an agent of the law, not a subject of a peasant's riddle. Finally, the teacher spoke of the seed that fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, multiplying 30, 60, or even 100 times what was sown. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. The teacher stopped. The boat bobbed gently on the water. The story was over. Elias frowned. There was no call to arms, no demand for taxes, no prophecy of Rome's destruction, just a story about farming. It seemed harmless, almost banal. Yet, as Elias looked around, he saw the effect it had. The silence was heavier now. The people were not just entertained, they were introspective. They were looking inward, asking themselves which soil they were. Elias realized the danger was not in the complexity of the words, but in their simplicity. This man was bypassing the intellect and aiming straight for the conscience. He was making every listener a judge of their own heart. Elias finished his notes. He wrote that the subject used vague metaphors to avoid direct incitement, yet manipulated the crowd into self-reflection that bypassed the authority of the temple. It was a clever legal defense, but it was dangerous influence. As the crowd began to disperse, Elias remained standing. He looked at the hard-packed dirt under his sandals. He thought of the birds snatching away the seed. He thought of his mission. Was he the path? Was he the hard ground where the truth could not penetrate? He crushed the thought instantly. He was the defender of the covenant. He was the wheat, not the soil. But as he turned to leave, the image of the sower haunted him. The farmer in the story was generous, scattering seed even on ground that seemed hopeless. Why waste seed on the path? Why waste it on rocks? Unless the farmer was not worried about scarcity, unless the farmer believed that even the hardest ground might, just maybe, crack open. Elias walked back toward the village of Capernaum to find lodging. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. He felt a strange exhaustion, not of the body, but of the mind. He had come to catch a rebel in a lie, but he had walked away with a question he could not answer. He told himself it was just the heat. He told himself that tomorrow he would find the error he needed. But deep down, the seed had been cast, and for the first time in his life, Elias was not sure if he could stop it from landing. Elias found himself sitting in the corner of a dimly lit courtyard in a town halfway between the lake and the mountains. He had traded his fine linen tunic for the rough wool of a laborer, rubbing dirt into his fingernails and allowing his beard to grow unkempt. To the world, he was just another traveler seeking truth. To himself, he was a spy in the house of the enemy. The air in the courtyard was thick with tension. The followers of the Nazarene were not the unified army Elias had expected. They were a fractured collection of confused souls. He sat quietly, nursing a cup of water, listening to a heated argument breaking out near the fire. Two men were debating. One was a zealot, his hand constantly drifting to the knife concealed in his belt. The other was a quiet, older man who looked like he had spent his life accounting for coins. They were arguing about the company the teacher kept. The zealot was furious. He hissed that there were traitors in their midst, people who were only there for the free bread or the spectacle. He pointed out a group of men laughing loudly near the gate, men who looked more like bandits than disciples. The zealot demanded to know why the teacher did not cast them out. If this was the kingdom of God, why was it filled with such filth? Elias leaned in, his interest piqued. This was the fracture he had been looking for. If the movement could not police its own members, it would crumble from within. He waited for the older man to agree, to call for a purge. Instead, the older man sighed and shook his head. He recounted a story the teacher had told them earlier that day, when the crowds were pressing in against the heat of the afternoon. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. Elias listened intently. He knew the agriculture of the region. The weeds mentioned were likely darnel, a poisonous plant that looked exactly like wheat in its early stages. You could not tell them apart until the very end. The older man continued. The servants in the story had asked the master if they should go and pull up the weeds. It was the logical response. It was what Elias would have done. It was what the Sanhedrin did: root out heresy before it could spread. But the master in the parable had said no. He warned that in gathering the weeds, they might uproot the wheat along with them. He ordered them to let both grow together until the harvest. Only then would the harvesters collect the weeds to be burned and gather the wheat into the barn. The zealot fell silent, clearly unsatisfied but silenced by the authority of the story. But inside Elias, a different kind of storm began to brew. This teaching was dangerous. It was radical tolerance. Elias understood the implications immediately. The teacher was claiming that it was not the job of men to judge the heart. He was reserving the right of judgment for God alone, and only at the end of time. For a man like Elias, whose entire life was built on the structure of immediate laws and immediate punishments, this was anarchy. If you let the weeds grow, they would steal the water and nutrients from the wheat. Unless, Elias thought, the teacher believed the wheat was strong enough to survive anything. He looked around the courtyard again. He saw sincere faces, eyes wet with repentance. He saw cunning faces, eyes darting with greed. They were all mixed together, eating from the same bowl, walking the same road. The teacher walked among them, treating them all with a terrifying patience. He knew who the weeds were. Elias was certain of it. The man from Nazareth had eyes that seemed to strip away pretenses. He knew there were enemies in his camp, yet he fed them. Elias felt a cold shiver. He realized that in the context of the parable, he himself was a weed. He was an enemy who had crept in while the master was sleeping. He stood up and moved closer to the group, deciding to test this philosophy. He sat down next to the older man and introduced himself as a wanderer from the south. He asked if the teacher truly believed that evil should be tolerated alongside good. The older man looked at Elias. His eyes were tired but kind. He said that perhaps the master was patient because he knew that sometimes, before the harvest comes, a weed can change into wheat. Elias scoffed internally. Nature did not work that way. A weed was always a weed. But as he looked at the motley crew around the fire, he realized the teacher was not talking about botany. He was gambling on the human soul. It was a reckless gamble. It was a strategy that would surely fail. And yet, Elias decided he would stay. He would be the weed that did not change. He would grow tall and strong among them, and when the time was right, he would be the one to choke the life out of this movement. 2 weeks later, Elias had managed to work his way closer to the inner circle. He was no longer just a face in the crowd. He was a familiar presence, helping to carry supplies and listening quietly while the chosen 12 debated among themselves. They had moved away from the towns and were resting near a large garden. The spring growth was vibrant. Elias watched the disciples. They were impressive in their devotion but pathetic in their influence. There were fishermen who smelled of the lake, a tax collector who was hated by his own kin, and a few zealots who looked ready to fight a war with sticks and stones. Elias sat with his back against a stone wall, composing a mental letter to the high priest. He intended to write that the movement was fundamentally weak. They had no weapons, no money, and their leader spoke in riddles that confused even his closest friends. Rome had nothing to fear from this ragtag band. But then, the teacher stood up. He walked over to a patch of wild mustard plants. He plucked a tiny seed from a pod and held it up. It was so small that from where Elias sat, it was invisible. The teacher asked them what the kingdom of God was like. He answered his own question. It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all seeds on earth. Yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all garden plants, with such big branches that the birds of the air can perch in its shade. Elias stared at the mustard plant nearby. It was true. The seed was like a speck of dust, but the bush was aggressive, invasive, and grew rapidly, taking over the field. The metaphor hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. He had been measuring the danger of this movement by its current size. He had been counting swords and coins, but the teacher was playing a different game. He was not building a fortress. He was planting an infection. Elias looked at the disciples again. He no longer saw simple fishermen. He saw the seeds of something that could expand uncontrollably. If this idea, this kingdom of mercy, of weeds growing with wheat, of fathers running to prodigals took root in the hearts of the common people, it would be impossible to stop. You can kill a soldier, but you cannot kill a harvest that has already spread. And the detail about the birds. Elias knew his scripture. In the ancient prophecies, great empires were often described as trees where the birds of the air nested. By using this image, The teacher was claiming that his kingdom would rival the great powers of the world. He was saying that one day, the nations, the Gentiles, the Romans, the Greeks, would come to find shelter in the branches of a movement started by a Jewish carpenter. It was an ambition so vast it bordered on madness or divinity. Elias felt a sudden, urgent fear. He realized his earlier assessment was wrong. This was not a minor disturbance. This was a threat to the very foundation of the temple and the empire. A fortress could be besieged. A tree with deep roots and wide branches could only be destroyed if you dug it up entirely, and even then, if one seed remained, it would start again. He excused himself from the group, claiming he needed to wash in the stream. Once out of sight, he retrieved a small roll of parchment from his pack. His hands shook slightly as he mixed the ink. He did not write that the movement was weak. He wrote that the danger was existential. "We are looking for a fire," he wrote, the letters sharp and dark on the page, "but this man is bringing a flood. It starts as a trickle, silent and small, but it rises until it covers everything. He speaks of a kingdom that grows in secret. He is planting ideas that will outlast our stone walls. We cannot wait for him to make a political mistake. By the time he does, the roots will be too deep to pull." Elias sealed the letter with wax. He needed to send this to Jerusalem immediately. The mustard seed was already in the ground. He could see the soil shifting. As he walked back to the group, he looked at the teacher with a new kind of intensity. He was no longer just a critic. He was a man who realized he was standing in the path of a slow-moving landslide. The battle was not about law anymore. It was about survival. And Elias was determined that his world, his traditions, and his order would not be the things that withered in the shade of this new tree. Elias separated from the main group of disciples as they neared the Jordan River. He needed to send another dispatch to Jerusalem, and the trade route to Jericho offered the fastest couriers. The road was notorious, a steep descent through desolate, rocky terrain known as the Way of Blood. It was a place where shadows stretched long and bandits waited in the silence between the crags. He traveled alone, moving with the hurried, nervous gait of a man who knew the dangers. He kept his hand near the small dagger concealed in his sash. The air grew hotter as the elevation dropped, pressing against his lungs. Suddenly, a commotion ahead forced him to dive behind a large boulder. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. Peering around the edge of the stone, he saw the aftermath of violence. A traveler lay face down in the dirt, stripped of his tunic, his body motionless. The attackers were already gone, vanishing into the limestone caves like smoke. Elias remained frozen. He was a scholar, not a soldier. If he stepped out, the bandits might return. Minutes dragged like hours. Then the sound of footsteps approached. Elias felt a surge of relief. He recognized the distinct robes of a priest from Jerusalem. This was a man of God, a guardian of the covenant. Elias prepared to stand up and join him, to offer help to the wounded man. But the priest did not slow down. He saw the body in the road, the blood pooling in the dust, and he hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Elias watched in disbelief as the priest moved to the far side of the road, gathering his hem tight against his ankles to avoid contact. Elias understood the logic instantly. To touch a corpse, or even a man who might die while you held him, was to become ritually unclean. It would require days of purification. It would prevent the priest from performing his duties. The law was clear. Purity came first. The priest hurried past, eyes fixed on the horizon, leaving the man to die. Elias sank back behind the rock, confused. He understood the law, yet a bitter taste filled his mouth. A short time later, another man appeared, a Levite, an assistant in the temple. Surely, he would stop. He was less bound by the strictures of the high priesthood. He approached the body, looked down, and paused. Elias saw curiosity in his face, perhaps a moment of pity. But fear won. The road was dangerous. Stopping made you a target. The Levite stepped over the victim's outstretched hand and quickened his pace, vanishing down the curve of the road. Elias felt a cold cynicism settle over him. This was the reality of their world. Preservation of self, preservation of status. He was about to leave his hiding place, accepting that the man was doomed, when he heard the clip-clop of a donkey. A third traveler appeared. Elias squinted. The style of the tunic, the cut of the beard, It was a Samaritan. Elias felt an instinctive recoil. These were the enemies of his people, half-breeds with distorted scriptures and a rival temple. In Jerusalem, they were considered worse than heathens. Elias expected the Samaritan to kick the dying Jewish man, or perhaps rob him of whatever scraps remained. Instead, the Samaritan stopped. He dismounted immediately. He did not look around for bandits. He looked only at the wounds. Elias watched, stunned, as the enemy knelt in the dirt. The Samaritan pulled out a flask of wine to clean the cuts and oil to soothe them. He tore strips from his own head covering to bind the wounds. There was no hesitation about ritual purity. There was no fear of being attacked. There was only an urgent, clumsy tenderness. The Samaritan lifted the groaning man, struggling under the dead weight, and hoisted him onto his own donkey. He did not leave him there. He walked beside the beast, steadying the stranger with one hand. Elias remained hidden until they were long gone. He slumped against the hard rock, his mind reeling. He had heard the teacher tell a story exactly like this. He had thought it was a piece of fiction, a hyperbolic insult to the priesthood. But he had just watched it happen in the dust of the Jericho road. The priest and the Levite, men Elias had spent his life emulating, had walked away. The Samaritan, the man Elias had been taught to despise, had acted like a brother. The definition of neighbor was shifting beneath his feet. The law said, "Love your neighbor," and Elias had always defined that as loving his own kind, his own tribe, those who kept the rules. But the road to Jericho had no tribes. It only had the suffering and the one who stopped. Elias realized with a jolt of horror that in this scenario, God was not walking with the priest. God was walking with the Samaritan. And if that was true, then everything Elias knew about holiness was wrong. Elias arrived in Jericho shaken, but he did not send his letter. The words he had planned to write about the righteousness of the Sanhedrin now felt hollow. Instead, he sought out the company of the disciples again, needing to understand the logic that drove them. He found Levi, the former tax collector, sitting by a fire outside the city walls. Levi was writing on a piece of parchment, his movements precise and practiced. Elias sat down opposite him. Levi was a man who understood numbers. He had spent his life calculating owed taxes, interest rates, and profit margins. If anyone could explain the economics of this movement, it was him. Elias went straight to the point. He brought up the story of the lost sheep. He asked Levi how a rational man could accept such a strategy. Elias argued his case with mathematical precision. If a shepherd has 100 sheep and loses one, the logical choice is to cut the loss. To leave 99 sheep alone in the open country exposed to wolves, thieves, and weather just to hunt for one foolish animal was not stewardship, it was negligence. You do not risk 99% of your assets to recover 1%. It was bad business. It was bad leadership. Levi stopped writing. He looked at Elias across the flickering flames. The firelight danced in his eyes that had seen the hatred of his neighbors for years when he sat in the tax booth. Levi agreed quietly. He said that from the perspective of a hireling, Elias was absolutely right. A hireling counts the sheep as currency. If one is lost, it is just a deduction from the ledger. But, Levi said, the story is not about a hireling. It is about an owner who loves the flock. Levi leaned forward. He asked Elias if he had ever been the one. Elias blinked, taken aback. He replied that he had always been among the 99. He kept the law. He observed the Sabbath. He was safe in the fold. Levi smiled, a sad, knowing smile. He told Elias that he, Levi, had been the one. He had been the tax collector, the traitor, the one excluded from the synagogue, the one people spat on in the street. He was the sheep that had wandered so far into the wilderness of greed that he thought he would die there. Levi described the feeling of being lost. It was not just about location, it was about the crushing weight of knowing you are unwanted. He told Elias that when the teacher looked at him in the tax booth and said, "Follow me," it was the first time in his life someone had come looking for him. The teacher did not wait for Levi to clean himself up. He did not wait for Levi to repay all the money he had extorted. He came to the booth, to the place of sin, and called him by name. Levi explained that the math of the kingdom of heaven is not based on volume, it is based on value. To the shepherd, the one lost sheep is worth the entire journey. The 99 are safe, yes, but the heart of the shepherd is with the one who is in danger. He asked Elias a question that pierced through his scholarly defenses. What happens, Elias, if one day you stumble? What happens if you break a law, or lose your faith, or find yourself alone in the dark? Do you want a God who counts you as a statistic and writes you off as an acceptable loss, or do you want a shepherd who will leave everything to find you? Elias sat in silence. The night wind howled around the walls of Jericho. He had always taken pride in his standing among the righteous. He was one of the 99 who did not need to repent. But as he looked at Levi, a man who had been found and restored, Elias felt a sudden, aching void in his own chest. He realized he was safe, but he was not cherished. He was part of the herd, but he did not know the shepherd's voice. Levi went back to his writing, leaving the question hanging in the air. Elias looked out at the darkness beyond the firelight. He began to wonder if his righteousness was not a fold, but a cage. And for the first time, he felt a strange envy for the lost sheep, the one who had felt the strong arms of the shepherd lifting him up, carrying him home with joy. The absurdity of the search was the measure of the love. And Elias, with all his logic and laws, had never known a love like that. Sleep refused to come to Elias that night. The ground beneath him was hard, but it was the conversation with Levi that made rest impossible. The fire had long since burned down to gray ash, and the camp was silent, save for the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping disciples. Elias lay on his back, staring up into the void of the dark sky, but his mind was back in the village where he had first heard the story of the father and his 2 sons. When he had first heard the parable from the tanner, Elias had focused entirely on the younger son, the rebellion, the waste, the pigs, the smell of shame. It was a clear-cut case of lawlessness. Elias had judged the boy instantly. But now, in the quiet of the wilderness, with Levi's words about the lost sheep echoing in his ears, the second half of the story returned to haunt him. It rose up from his memory not as a footnote, but as an accusation. Elias closed his eyes and let the story play out again. But this time, he did not stand with the father, nor did he watch the younger son leave. This time, he placed himself in the field with the older brother. He imagined the heat of the day. He felt the ache in his muscles from plowing rows that never seemed to end. The older brother was the model of consistency. He did not run away. He did not ask for his inheritance early. He stayed. He obeyed. He did exactly what was expected of him. He was the pillar of the family, the one who ensured the farm survived while the father grieved and the brother squandered. Elias knew this feeling well. It was the feeling of his own life. He had spent his youth studying the Torah while others played. He had fasted while others feasted. He had kept his record clean, meticulously avoiding every form of impurity. He was the older brother. In his mind, he heard the sound of music drifting from the house. The older brother in the parable came in from the field, tired and sweaty, expecting perhaps a quiet meal and rest. Instead, he heard dancing. He heard laughter. He smelled the aroma of the fattened calf, the prize of the flock, reserved for a special occasion. Elias felt the surge of confusion the older brother must have felt. He asked a servant what was happening, and the answer was a blow to the gut. Your brother has come home safe and sound, and your father has killed the fattened calf. Safe and sound? After what he did? Elias felt the older brother's rage burn in his own chest. It was a cold, hard anger. It was the anger of the diligent man who sees the lazy man get the reward. It was the anger of the rule keeper who watches the rule breaker get a party. The older brother refused to go in. He stood outside the house, arms crossed, his heart hardening into stone. And then, the most shocking part of the story occurred. The father came out. Just as the father had run to meet the younger son in his shame, he now left the party to plead with the older son in his pride. He humbled himself twice. Elias replayed the older brother's words to his father. They were words Elias could have written himself. Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. Elias sat up in the darkness, clutching his knees. The truth of those words struck him like a physical blow. I have been slaving for you. That was the key. The older brother did not view himself as a son. He viewed himself as a slave. He viewed the Father not as a parent to be loved, but as a master to be pleased, an employer who owed him payment. His obedience was not born of relationship, it was born of transaction. He believed that because he had put in the work, he was owed the reward. Elias realized with a terrifying clarity that he was looking into a mirror. He served God, yes. He obeyed the commandments, absolutely. But why? Was it because he loved the Almighty, or was it because he was terrified of punishment and expectant of status? He looked over at the sleeping form of Levi. Levi was the younger son. He had run away, wasted his life, and returned with nothing. And Jesus, the storyteller, was saying that Levi was already at the feast. Levi was inside, enjoying the grace of the Father. And Elias? Elias was the one standing outside in the dark. The realization made him tremble. The older brother was just as lost as the younger one. The younger son was lost in a foreign land. The older son was lost in the Father's house. The younger son was lost in rebellion. The older son was lost in self-righteousness. Elias had always believed there were two kinds of people, the righteous and the sinners, but the parable destroyed that division. It showed that both sons were alienated from the Father's heart. One used his badness to run away from the Father. The other used his goodness to try to control the Father. In the story, the Father's response to the angry son was tender, not harsh. "My son," the Father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." Elias whispered the words into the night air. "Everything I have is yours." The older brother had missed it. He had access to the Father's joy, the Father's table, the Father's love every single day. But he had been too busy working for it to enjoy it. He had been so focused on earning his inheritance that he forgot he already possessed it. He was a son living like a hired hand. Elias felt a crack form in the armor of his pride. He had spent his life building a resume of righteousness to present to God. He thought his discipline made him superior to men like Levi. But in the eyes of the teacher, Elias's pride was a barrier just as thick as Levi's greed had been. In fact, it might be thicker. The younger son knew he was lost. He knew he needed mercy. He came home desperate. The older brother thought he was found. He thought he was right. He did not feel a need for mercy. He felt a demand for justice, and that made him blind. Elias looked at the stars, feeling small and exposed. He realized that the invitation of the Nazarene was not just for the tax collectors and the harlots to repent of their sins. It was an invitation for the religious, the scholars, and the keepers of the law to repent of their righteousness. It was a call to stop slaving in the field and come into the feast. But the feast required humility. To enter the house, the older brother would have to sit at the same table as the younger brother. He would have to accept that his years of hard work did not give him a better seat than the boy who had wasted everything. He would have to admit that grace was not fair. Could Elias do that? Could he sit next to a Samaritan, a leper, or a tax collector, and admit that he was no more deserving of God's love than they were? The thought revolted him. It went against every instinct of justice he had ever learned. It felt reckless. It felt wrong. And yet, it felt like the only thing that could explain the peace he saw on Levi's face. The story of the two sons did not have an ending. Jesus had left it hanging. The Father issues the invitation, but the listener never learns if the older brother went in. Did he swallow his pride and join the dance? Or did he stay outside in the cold, clutching his resentment, convinced of his own moral superiority? Elias lay back down, pulling his cloak tight around his shoulders. He knew why the story had no ending. The teacher had left it unfinished because the ending was not written on a scroll. The ending was being written right now, in the heart of every Pharisee and scribe who heard it. Elias was the older brother, and the father was standing in the courtyard, pleading with him to come inside. The music was playing. The door was open, but Elias was not yet ready to move. He was still too angry at the grace that could forgive a wasted life so easily. He closed his eyes, but the image of the open door burned behind his eyelids, a torment and a hope he could not escape. The night dragged on, and for the first time in his life, Elias felt the terrible, crushing weight of his own goodness. Elias needed a reprieve. The constant travel, the sleeping on hard ground, and the emotional battery of the parables had worn him thin. When the group neared a prosperous trading town on the western shore of the lake, Elias decided to use his connections. He had a distant cousin named Joram residing there, a merchant of considerable influence who dealt in purple dyes and imported linens. It was a chance to wash the dust from his skin, eat a meal that did not taste of campfire smoke, and reconnect with the world he actually belonged to. He left the disciples near the water and made his way up the paved streets toward the district of the wealthy. The contrast was jarring. Down by the lake, the air smelled of fish and sweat. Here, it smelled of jasmine and roasting meat. The houses were fortresses of stone, guarded by iron gates and private security. Elias arrived at Joram's estate just as the sun began to dip. The entrance was imposing. However, what caught Elias's attention was not the architecture, but the obstacle in front of it. Lying directly beside the heavy iron gate was a man. He was in a wretched state, his body thin and wasted, his skin covered in open sores that looked angry and painful. Stray dogs were sniffing around him, occasionally licking at his wounds. Elias paused. The man looked up with eyes that had long ago lost the light of hope. He did not ask for money. He simply stared, perhaps wishing for the crumbs that might fall from a delivery cart. Elias felt a sudden, sharp twinge in his chest. He reached for his coin purse, but then the gate swung open. A servant ushered him in, complaining loudly about the trash that accumulated outside and promising to have the guards remove the beggar before the guests arrived. Elias stepped inside, leaving the man behind. The heavy gate clanged shut, silencing the world of suffering instantly. Inside, Joram welcomed him with an embrace that smelled of expensive perfume. Elias was led to a dining hall that dazzled the eyes. The table was low and laden with silver platters. There was wine from the best vineyards of Judea, fruits from distant lands, and breads of the finest flour. Joram was dressed in purple and fine linen, the very picture of success and divine favor. Elias reclined at the table, accepting a goblet of wine. For a moment, he felt relief. This was civilization. This was the reward for righteousness. Joram spoke loudly, boasting of his latest shipments and the profits he had turned. He complained about the Roman taxes and the incompetence of his workers, but he spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he was master of his own destiny. But as Elias looked at Joram, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. The teacher's voice returned to his mind, unbidden, narrating a story that seemed to be happening right in front of him. There was a rich man, the teacher had said, who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate lay a beggar named Lazarus, covered in sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Elias lowered his cup. The wine suddenly tasted like vinegar. He looked at Joram's purple robe. He looked at the fine linen draped over the couches. He thought of the man outside the gate. The parallel was not subtle. It was a mirror image. Joram noticed Elias's distraction. He asked if the journey had been too hard, or if the rumors of the peasant rabbi were troubling him. Joram laughed, a deep, satisfied sound. He dismissed the Nazarene as a nuisance, a fly buzzing around a horse. He claimed that God blessed the righteous with wealth and punished the wicked with poverty. If the man at the gate was suffering, surely it was because of some secret sin or generational curse. It was not Joram's responsibility to interfere with God's judgment. Elias listened, but he was no longer hearing Joram. He was hearing the rest of the parable. The time came when the beggar died and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus by his side. Elias looked at his cousin. Joram was vibrant, healthy, and powerful, but the story stripped all that away. It showed the end. Elias saw the terrifying reversal. He imagined Joram, stripped of his purple, stripped of his silver, crying out for a single drop of water to cool his tongue. The horror of the parable was not that the rich man was wealthy. It was that he was blind. He had stepped over Lazarus every day. He had normalized the suffering at his doorstep. He had built a life so comfortable that he could no longer see the humanity of the man dying 5 feet away. Elias realized with a jolt that he was doing the same thing. He had stepped over the beggar to enter the feast. He was reclining here, discussing theology and politics, while a son of Abraham lay in the dirt with the dogs. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." The conversation at the table turned to the topic of the prophets. Joram claimed to be a devout student of Moses. He argued that they needed to protect the traditions of the elders. Elias interrupted him, his voice trembling slightly. He asked Joram a strange question. He asked, "If someone came back from the dead to warn us, would we listen?" Joram stared at him, confused. He asked what Elias meant. Elias recounted the end of the parable. The rich man, realizing his own fate was sealed, begged Abraham to send Lazarus back to earth to warn his 5 brothers so that they would not come to the place of torment. Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." But the rich man said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." Elias leaned forward, staring intensely at his cousin. This was the crux of the matter. This was the warning that made his blood run cold. Abraham said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead." Joram scoffed. He broke a piece of bread and dipped it in oil. He said that was a ridiculous story. Of course, they would believe if someone rose from the dead. That would be the ultimate sign. That would be proof undeniable. Who could ignore a resurrection? But Elias knew better now. He looked at Joram's hardened face, a face satisfied with its own righteousness, a face that felt no need for mercy because it felt no guilt. Elias realized that miracles do not change hearts. They only confirm what is already there. If a heart is hard toward the poor, if a heart is deaf to the law of love written by Moses, then even a dead man walking would be dismissed as a trick, a hallucination, or a threat. The terrifying truth of the parable settled over Elias. The chasm between the rich man and Lazarus was not just a canyon in the afterlife. It was a chasm existing right now. It was the gate. It was the wall Joram had built around his conscience. Elias stood up abruptly. He could not eat. The luxury of the room felt suffocating, like the air in a tomb. He told Joram he could not stay. Joram was offended. He asked where Elias was going, back to the dust and the rabble, back to the lunatics. Elias did not answer. He turned and walked out of the hall, down the corridor, and toward the heavy iron gate. He pushed it open. The beggar was still there. He was shivering now as the evening air cooled. Elias stopped. He did not have a lot of money on him, only what was necessary for his travel. But he knelt down. He took out his water skin and offered the man a drink. He took the bread he had shoved into his pocket and placed it in the man's hands. It was a small act. It did not fix the man's life. It did not cure his sores. But as Elias looked into the beggar's eyes, he felt the chasm close, just a fraction. He was terrified of the purple robes now. He was terrified of the blindness that came with comfort. He walked away from his cousin's house, back toward the darkness of the lakeshore where the disciples were camping. He walked with a new urgency. The words, "Even if someone rises from the dead," echoed in his footsteps. Elias had a sinking feeling that the teacher was not just telling a story. He was making a prophecy. A day was coming when death would be defeated, and Elias feared that even then, the men in the high towers, the men like Joram, and perhaps men like himself, would still refuse to see. The test was not in the miracle. The test was at the gate, and Elias knew he had very little time left to learn how to open it. The atmosphere around the teacher had shifted. The casual, sunny days of teaching by the lakeside were being replaced by a sense of urgency. The group was moving toward Jerusalem, and with every mile south, the shadow of the capital loomed larger. Elias felt the tension in his own chest. He was carrying a satchel full of notes, observations, and transcripts, his harvest of intelligence. But as he sat among the disciples during a midday rest, the teacher began to speak of a different kind of accounting. The teacher told a story about a master preparing for a long journey. Before leaving, he called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 talents of gold. To another, 2. To the last, 1. Each was given according to his ability. Then the master left. Elias listened, his mind instantly categorizing the story. It sounded like a standard lesson on economics or diligence. He watched the faces of the disciples. They were simple men, and a talent was a fortune, wages for a lifetime of labor. The idea of holding such wealth clearly made them dizzy. The story continued. The man who had received 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. The one with 2 talents did the same and gained 2 more. They took risks. They entered the market. They traded. They exposed the master's wealth to the world, and it multiplied. But the man who had received 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Elias nodded almost imperceptibly. He understood that third servant. The world was dangerous. Thieves were everywhere. Markets crashed. To bury the coin was the safest option. It was preservation. It was prudent. It ensured that exactly what was given would be returned. No loss, no risk. Then, the master returned to settle accounts. The first 2 servants approached with joy. "Master," they said, "you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have gained 5 more." The master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." The same praise was given to the one with 2 talents. The reward was not based on the total amount, but on the faithfulness of the effort. Then the man who had received 1 talent came. His explanation was the moment Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. "Master," the servant said, "I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." Elias froze. The excuse was perfect. It was logical. It was respectful, in a twisted way. The servant claimed he was acting out of fear of the master's severity. He was saying, "I did not want to lose what was yours." But the master's response was not relief, it was fury. "You wicked, lazy servant," the master replied. "So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown? Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned I would have received it back with interest." The master ordered the talent to be taken from him and given to the one who had 10, and then came the sentence that made Elias's blood run cold. "And throw that worthless servant outside, into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." The story ended, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Elias stood up and walked away from the circle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He sought solitude behind a grove of olive trees. He needed to think. "I knew that you are a hard man." That was it. That was the poison in the servant's heart. He viewed the master not as a source of opportunity, but as a source of terror. He did not love the master. He feared him, and because he feared him, he chose safety over service. He chose to bury the gift rather than risk using it. Elias looked down at his own hands. He held a stylus and a scroll. He possessed intellect, training, influence, and a position in the Sanhedrin. These were his talents. And what was he doing with them? He was burying them. He was hiding his true thoughts. He was hiding the questions that were burning in his soul. He was hiding the fact that he was beginning to believe this man might actually be sent by God. He was burying the truth under layers of reports and espionage because he was afraid. He was afraid of the high priest, his earthly master, who was indeed a hard man. He was afraid of losing his status. He was afraid of being cast out of the synagogue, so he kept his head down. He kept his mouth shut. He wrote reports that were technically true but spiritually hollow, preserving his safety while the truth rotted in the ground. A young man named Micah, one of the newer followers who often shadowed Elias, approached him. Micah looked nervous. He confessed to Elias that he had not told his family he was here. He said he was keeping his discipleship a secret until he was sure it was safe. He asked Elias if that was wise. Elias looked at Micah. He saw the third servant standing right in front of him, a man paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake, a man digging a hole to hide his light. "You are afraid," Elias said, his voice harsh. Micah nodded. "The priests are powerful, if I am wrong." "If you bury what you have been given," Elias interrupted, "you have already lost it." The words tasted like ash in Elias's mouth because he was preaching to himself. He realized that doing nothing was not neutrality, it was wickedness. The master in the story did not condemn the servant for stealing. He condemned him for wasting. He condemned him for playing it safe. Elias realized that the kingdom this teacher spoke of was not for the cautious. It was for the risk-takers. It was for those willing to bet everything, reputation, life, safety, on the character of the king. The first 2 servants traded with the money because they trusted the master's joy. The third servant hid the money because he trusted only the master's anger. Elias pulled out the scroll he had been preparing for Jerusalem. It contained a list of the teacher's movements and a transcript of his critiques against the Pharisees. It was his insurance policy. It was the talent he was returning to the Sanhedrin, exactly as they expected. Here is what belongs to you. But now, looking at the ink, he saw it for what it was, a shovel. He was digging a hole. He was preserving his standing by burying the truth. He looked at Micah again. "Do not be like me," Elias whispered. "Do not let fear decide your future. If you believe this man has the words of life, then spend your life on him. Do not hoard it." Micah looked confused by the intensity in Elias's eyes, but he nodded slowly and walked back toward the group. Elias remained alone. He held the scroll over a small fire that had been left burning by shepherds. He watched the edges curl. He could burn it. He could stop being the spy. He could take the 5 talents of his intellect and use them to defend this man, to argue his case before the council. It would be a supreme risk. It could cost him his life. But his hand stopped. The face of the high priest flashed in his mind, the cold, hard eyes of authority. The fear was too deep. The habit of self-preservation was too strong. Elias pulled the scroll back from the heat. He rolled it up tight and shoved it into his tunic. He could not burn it. Not yet. He was the third servant. He knew it with a sickening certainty. He was choosing the safety of the hole over the danger of the market. He walked back to the camp, feeling the weight of the hidden scroll against his chest like a stone. The teacher was laughing with the disciples, explaining the joy of the master. Elias sat on the edge of the light, in the shadows, already feeling the chill of the outer darkness creeping in. He had his safety, yes, but looking at the firelight reflecting in the eyes of the brave men around him, Elias knew he had lost everything that mattered. The walls of Jerusalem loomed ahead, massive and unforgiving. To Elias, they had always looked like protection, a stone embrace keeping the covenant safe from the pagan world. Now, as he walked through the heavy gates, they looked like the walls of a prison. The noise of the city hit him instantly, the shouting of merchants, the bleating of sacrificial lambs, the arrogant clatter of Roman hooves on stone. He made his way straight to the Temple Mount. He still carried the scroll in his tunic, the damning report on the Nazarene that he was expected to deliver to the high priest. But before the politics, he needed the ritual. He needed to wash the dust of Galilee from his hands and the confusion of the road from his soul. He needed to remind himself of who he was, a guardian of the law, a son of the covenant, a righteous man. Elias moved through the court of the Gentiles, pushing past the money changers and the bird sellers. He entered the court of Israel, the sacred space reserved for Jewish men. Here, the air was thicker with incense and piety. It was the hour of prayer. Men were gathering, finding their spots, preparing to address the Almighty. Elias intended to walk to the front, to the place of honor near the steps where the elders stood. That was his place. He had earned it through years of study and rigorous discipline. But as he stepped forward, a movement caught his eye. A man was standing prominently at the front, apart from the crowd to ensure he was seen. Elias recognized him. It was a Pharisee named Simon, a man known for his strict adherence to the smallest details of the law. Simon stood tall, his arms raised high, his prayer shawl draped perfectly over his shoulders. He was not just praying, he was performing. Elias stopped to listen. Simon's voice carried over the murmurs of the crowd, confident and booming. "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector." Elias followed Simon's gaze. In the back of the court, hidden in the shadows of a pillar, stood another man. He was a tax collector, a collaborator with Rome, a man whose very profession made him ritually unclean and socially despised. He was the weed among the wheat. Simon continued his prayer, listing his resume to heaven. "I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get." Elias nodded instinctively. This was the standard. This was the definition of righteousness: fasting, tithing, separation from sinners. Simon was presenting his credentials to God, demanding recognition for his performance. Elias felt a familiar comfort in this. He too fasted twice a week. He too gave a tenth of his mint and cumin. He too was not like the robbers or the tax collectors. But then, the memory of a parable pierced his mind. Only a few days ago, the teacher had described this exact scene. He had told of 2 men going up to the temple to pray. One exalted himself, the other humbled himself. Elias looked back at the tax collector. The man was not looking up to heaven. He would not even lift his eyes. He stood hunched over, beating his breast with a fist, a sign of deep, agonizing grief. His prayer was a whisper, but in the silence between Simon's boasts, it drifted to Elias's ears like a thunderclap. God have mercy on me, a sinner. 7 words, no resume, no defense, no comparison to others, just a naked admission of bankruptcy. Elias froze. He was standing physically between the two men. To his right was the Pharisee, the image of success, the man Elias aspired to be. To his left was the tax collector, the image of failure, the man Elias had spent his life avoiding. In any other week of his life, Elias would have walked to the right. He would have joined Simon, thanked God for his own purity, and looked with pity on the wretch in the back. But the teacher's verdict on this story rang in his ears. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Justified, the word hung in the air. Simon the Pharisee was not justified, but he had done everything right. He had kept the rules. He had preserved the tradition. How could he leave the temple empty? Because, Elias realized with a sickening jolt, Simon was not talking to God. He was talking to himself. He did not need mercy because he believed he had earned his standing. He was full of himself, leaving no room for God. The tax collector, however, was empty. He brought nothing but his sin, and because he was empty, he could be filled. Because he claimed no merit, he could receive mercy. Elias looked down at his own hands. He looked at the fringes of his garment, the phylactery bound to his arm. They suddenly felt like costumes. He realized that for years, his prayers had been copies of Simon's. Thank you that I am smart. Thank you that I am important. Thank you that I am not like the ignorant Galileans. He had been treating the temple like a marketplace where he traded his good deeds for God's favor. He thought he was buying righteousness, but he was only buying pride. The tax collector in the shadows let out a sob, beating his chest again. It was the sound of a heart breaking. It was the sound of truth. Elias took a step toward the front, toward Simon. He wanted to maintain the illusion. He wanted to go stand with the winners, but his legs refused to move. The hypocrisy was too heavy. He felt a sudden wave of nausea. If he went and stood with Simon now, knowing what he knew, he would be sealing his own fate. He would be the whitewashed tomb the teacher spoke of, beautiful on the outside, but full of dead men's bones on the inside. But could he go to the back? Could he stand with the traitor? Elias looked at the tax collector again. That was the only place where mercy was falling. It was not falling on the podium of the righteous. It was falling in the corner of the damned. Panic rose in Elias's throat. He was a scholar. He was a delegate of the Sanhedrin. He could not be seen beating his breast with the sinners. The cost to his reputation would be total. The high priest would hear of it. His career would be over. So he did neither. He did not join the Pharisee, and he could not bring himself to join the tax collector. He stood paralyzed in the middle ground, the scroll burning against his chest. He realized he was the most pitiable man in the court. The Pharisee was deluded but happy. The tax collector was broken but heard. Elias was just a fraud who knew the truth but was too cowardly to embrace it. He turned abruptly, pulling his hood over his face to hide his shame. He stumbled out of the court of Israel, past the altar, where the smoke of sacrifices rose, past the priests chanting their psalms. He pushed through the crowds, desperate to escape the suffocating holiness of the place. He ran until he was outside the temple walls, leaning against the rough stone, gasping for air. The scroll in his tunic felt heavier than ever. He had come to Jerusalem to report on a heretic. Instead, he had walked into the temple and found that the heretic was right. The system was broken. The prayers of the proud were hitting the ceiling and bouncing back. Elias slid down the wall until he was sitting in the dust of the street. He was not ready to be the tax collector. He was not ready to say, God have mercy on me, a sinner, in front of the world. But as he sat there, watching the pilgrims pass by, he whispered it quietly, under his breath, so that no one but God could hear. Have mercy. It was a small crack in the dam, a tiny fissure in the stone of his heart, but it was a start. The temple behind him stood magnificent and tall, but Elias knew now that the true temple was not made of gold and cedar. It was built in the crushed spirit of a man who knew he had nothing to offer, and for the first time in his life, Elias felt the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to prove. The summon came 2 days after the incident in the temple courts. Elias was called to the private chambers of the high priest, a room far removed from the public eye, where the true decisions of the nation were made. The atmosphere was brittle, ready to snap. There were no pleasantries, no offers of wine or water. Around the heavy oak table sat the inner circle of the Sanhedrin, men whose faces were etched with the burden of maintaining order in a powder keg. Elias stood at the end of the table. In his hand, he held the scroll he had carried all the way from Galilee. It was the report they had commissioned, the observations of a spy. But as he looked at the men before him, Elias realized with a sinking heart that the report was useless. They had not brought him here to learn facts. They had brought him here to confirm a verdict they had already reached. The high priest spoke first. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a blade before the strike. He stated that the situation had become intolerable. The Nazarene had entered Jerusalem not as a pilgrim, but as a king riding on a donkey. The crowds were shouting dangerous titles. Rome was watching from the Antonia fortress, their hands hovering over their sword hilts. If this enthusiasm boiled over during the feast, the legions would descend, and the temple would be the first casualty. He turned his cold gaze to Elias. He demanded to know if the teacher intended to incite a rebellion. He asked for the evidence that would allow them to arrest him quietly, away from the protection of the mob. Elias looked down at the scroll in his hand. He thought of the parables. He thought of the mustard seed, the yeast, the father running down the road. None of it was a call to arms. It was something far more terrifying, a call to a new heart. But how could he explain that to men who were obsessed with political survival? Elias took a breath and stepped into the dangerous territory he had been avoiding. He told them that the man carried no weapons. He told them that he preached payment of taxes to Caesar. He told them that his kingdom was not one that could be fought with swords. A murmur of dissatisfaction went around the table. An elder with a sharp, hawk-like nose slammed his hand down. He accused Elias of being naive. He argued that ideas were more dangerous than swords. If the people believed this man was the Messiah, they would revolt, regardless of what he preached. The belief itself was the weapon. The high priest leaned forward. He asked Elias for the fatal flaw, the blasphemy that would turn the people against him. Elias hesitated. He remembered the parable of the wheat and the weeds. He looked at the faces around him, men who believed they were the guardians of God's field. They were convinced that Jesus was the weed that needed to be pulled up to save the crop. But Elias now saw the field differently. "We must be careful," Elias said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his knees. He tells a story of a farmer who let the weeds grow alongside the wheat until the harvest. He warned that if you try to uproot the weeds too soon, you will destroy the wheat as well. The room went silent. The reference to the teacher's own words was a bold move. Elias pressed on. "If we arrest him now, openly, during the feast, the people will riot. We will be the ones destroying the vineyard. If this movement is of men, it will fail on its own. It will wither like seed on rocky ground. But if we strike him down, we might make him a martyr. We might be the ones who light the fire." He was using their own logic against them, pleading for patience, pleading for the harvest to be left in God's hands, not theirs. The high priest stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. He walked around the table until he was standing inches from Elias. He looked into Elias's eyes, searching for the deference that used to be there. He did not find it. "You speak of patience," the high priest said softly, "but patience is a luxury for those who do not bear the weight of the nation. While you were listening to stories by the seaside, we have been holding back the wrath of Rome. Do you know what happens if the governor decides we have lost control? They will not just kill the Nazarene. They will take away our place and our nation." Then, the high priest delivered the logic that shattered Elias's hope. "You do not understand," he said, addressing the room but keeping his eyes on Elias. "It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." The words hung in the air like a sentence of death. It was a cold, brutal calculus. One life traded for the safety of the many. It was political expediency masquerading as piety. In that sentence, Elias saw the rejection of every parable he had heard. The shepherd left the 99 to save the one. The Sanhedrin was willing to sacrifice the one to save the 99. The two kingdoms were in direct collision. Elias tried to speak again, to argue that shedding innocent blood could never save the nation, but the elder with the hawk nose interrupted him. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "You have been with him," the elder accused. "Your speech betrays you. You do not sound like a defender of the law anymore. You sound like one of his fishermen." The accusation hit the mark. The room erupted in agreement. They saw the hesitation in Elias. They saw the lack of fire in his eyes when he spoke of the threat. The high priest raised his hand for silence. He looked at Elias with a mixture of disappointment and contempt. He reached out and took the scroll from Elias's hand. He did not open it. He simply set it aside on the table, dismissing it as irrelevant. "We do not need your report, Elias," the high priest said, "and we no longer need your counsel. You are dismissed." It was not just a dismissal from the room, it was an expulsion from the inner circle. Elias realized he was being cast out. He was being separated. The winnowing fork he had feared was moving, but it was not God doing the separating, it was men. "But hear this," the high priest added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The harvest is coming, just as your teacher said. But we will be the harvesters, and we will not wait for the end of the age. We will clear the field before the Passover lamb is slaughtered." Elias was ushered out of the chamber by the guards. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his soul. He stood alone in the stone corridor. He was trembling, not from fear, but from the realization of what was about to happen. He had walked into that room thinking he could bridge the gap. He thought he could be the mediator between the law of Moses and the grace of the Nazarene. He thought he could save the wheat without burning the weeds. But the high priest was right about one thing: you cannot serve two masters. Elias walked slowly out of the palace complex. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the city. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was no longer welcome among the rulers, yet he was not fully one of the disciples. He was a man without a tribe. As he walked, the image of the wicked tenants came to his mind, another story he had heard whispered in the crowd. The owner of the vineyard sent servants to collect the fruit, but the tenants beat them. Finally, he sent his son, thinking, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and take his inheritance." Elias realized with horror that he had just left a meeting of the tenants. They were plotting to kill the heir to keep the vineyard for themselves. They believed they were saving the nation, but they were stealing the sovereignty of God. He stopped in the middle of the street. The crowds were bustling around him, unaware of the death sentence that had just been passed in the dark room above. Elias knew he had to do something. He had to warn them. He had to find Levi, or Peter, or the teacher himself. But as he turned to run, he stopped. Warn them of what? That power protects itself? That darkness hates the light? The teacher already knew. He had predicted it in every story. The rejected stone, the suffering servant, the seed that must fall into the ground and die. Elias realized that the confrontation in the chamber was not a failure of his diplomacy. It was the necessary unraveling of the plot. The wheat and the weeds were being revealed, not by their appearance, but by their reaction to the sun. The weeds were the ones sharpening their scythes. He pulled his cloak tight and disappeared into the labyrinth of the Jerusalem streets. He was no longer an observer. The neutrality he had clung to was gone. He had been vomited out by the beast of power. Now, he had only one place left to go. He headed toward the Mount of Olives, into the gathering dark, knowing that the greatest tragedy in history was being prepared, and he was helpless to stop it. He was only a witness to the coming storm. The night did not bring sleep. It brought chaos. Elias stood in the shadows of the lower courtyard, wrapped in a dark cloak that made him invisible against the stone walls. He was no longer a participant in the events of the nation. He was a ghost haunting the edges of a tragedy he had predicted but could not stop. The air was cold, biting through his layers, but the shivering that took hold of his limbs came from within. A noise erupted from the valley below, the sound of shouting, the clash of metal, and the chaotic trampling of boots. Torches snaked up the hill like a river of fire. The temple guard was returning. They had gone out with clubs and swords as if hunting a revolutionary, and now they were dragging their prize back to the house of the high priest. Elias pressed himself deeper into the recess of the wall. He saw the prisoner. The man from Nazareth was bound. his hands tied roughly behind his back. He was not struggling. There was no resistance, no shouting of commands to angels, no invocation of fire from heaven. He walked with a quiet dignity that made the chaotic aggression of the guards look small and desperate. They shoved him into the center of the courtyard before dragging him up the steps to the council chamber, the same room where Elias had been dismissed hours earlier. Elias knew the script. This was not a trial, it was a theater piece. The verdict had been written before the arrest was made. Elias moved closer, mingling with the servants and the off-duty soldiers warming themselves by a charcoal fire in the courtyard. The heat of the fire did not reach his heart. He listened to the voices around him. They were mocking the prisoner, calling him a false prophet, a deceiver. Then Elias saw a face he recognized. Peter, the fisherman, the one who had spoken so boldly by the lakeside, the one who had sworn he would never fall away even if everyone else did. Peter was sitting near the fire, looking terrified. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. A servant girl noticed him. She peered closely at his face, illuminated by the flickering orange light. She accused him of being with the Nazarene. Elias held his breath. This was the moment for the rock to stand firm. This was the moment for the seed on good soil to show its roots. "I do not know him," Peter snapped, his voice sharp with panic. Elias felt a wave of nausea. The rocky ground. The seed had sprouted quickly with joy, but now that the sun was scorching, the root was withering. Peter moved away, trying to blend into the darkness near the gate. But another person saw him. Another accusation. "I am not one of them," Peter shouted, an oath slipping from his lips to seal the lie. Elias watched the fisherman crumble. It was not judgment he felt for Peter, but a mirror of his own cowardice. Elias had stood in the council chamber and failed to stop the madness. Peter stood in the courtyard and failed to own his loyalty. Fear was the great leveler. It turned scholars and fishermen alike into traitors. Suddenly, the doors above opened. The council was dragging the prisoner out to transfer him to the Roman governor. As they passed through the courtyard, the rooster crowed, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd. The prisoner turned. His face was bruised, struck by the guards during the interrogation. He looked across the courtyard, straight at Peter. Elias expected to see anger in that look. He expected the look of a master betrayed by a servant, but what he saw stopped his heart. It was a look of infinite sadness and compassion. It was the look of the father watching the younger son leave home. It was the shepherd watching the sheep wander off. Peter saw it too. He broke. The big fisherman burst into tears, violent, racking sobs that shook his entire frame, and he ran out into the night. Elias remained. He followed the procession as they marched the prisoner to the praetorium, the fortress of Pilate. The religious charge of blasphemy would not work here. Rome did not care about Jewish laws, so the charge shifted. Now, they called him a king, a rival to Caesar. Elias stood at the back of the crowd that gathered as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. Pilate, the governor, stepped out onto the balcony. He looked bored, annoyed that his morning was interrupted by a religious squabble. He questioned the prisoner, but the answers were cryptic, frustrating the Romans' desire for simple logic. "What is truth?" Pilate asked with a sneer, turning his back on the very embodiment of it. Then came the final test. It was the custom to release one prisoner at the feast. To Pilate offered them a choice. On one side, the man from Nazareth, the teacher who healed and spoke of a kingdom of peace. On the other side, Barabbas. Elias knew Barabbas. Everyone did. He was a violent insurrectionist, a murderer, a man who believed that the only way to freedom was through blood. He was the weed in its purest form, choking, destructive, thorny. "Which one do you want me to release to you?" Pilate asked. Elias wanted to scream the name of the innocent one. He wanted to raise his voice above the madness. But the crowd was already moving, surging like a single beast, incited by the elders moving among them. "Barabbas," they screamed. "Give us Barabbas." The irony was suffocating. The name Barabbas meant son of the Father. The crowd was choosing the false son, the violent son, over the true son of the Father. They were choosing the sword over the word. They were choosing the darkness they understood over the light that terrified them. "What shall I do, then, with the one you call the King of the Jews?" "Crucify him," The roar was deafening. It was not just a shout, it was a demand for blood. Elias looked at the faces around him, faces twisted with irrational hate. These were the same people who had welcomed him with palm branches days ago. The soil had changed. The thorns had choked out the word completely. Pilate washed his hands in a basin of water, a futile gesture of innocence. He handed the prisoner over to be flogged and executed. Elias watched as they stripped the teacher and tied him to the post. He turned away when the first lash fell, the sound sickeningly wet against flesh. He could not watch the physical destruction, but he could not escape the spiritual reality. The parable of the tenants was being fulfilled in real time. This is the heir. Come, let us kill him. They were killing him not because he was a criminal, but because he was the mirror that showed them their own ugliness. The procession began toward the hill of execution outside the city walls. Elias followed at a distance, his legs heavy as lead. He saw the women weeping. He saw the prisoner stumble under the weight of the heavy crossbeam. Elias realized that the teacher was silent. As a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. He did not curse the crowd. He did not curse Pilate. He did not curse Elias for his silence. He simply carried the wood. This was the mystery that broke Elias's mind. Power usually fights back. Power usually defends itself. But this was a different kind of power. This was the power of the seed falling into the ground. It was the power of voluntary surrender. As they reached the place of the skull, Elias stopped. He could go no further. He stood on a ridge overlooking the site. He watched the hammers rise and fall. He heard the dull thud of iron against wood, and then the agonizing cry of a human being in ultimate distress. They lifted the cross into the sky. It stood stark and terrible against the gathering clouds. The darkness that the teacher had spoken of in his stories, the outer darkness, seemed to be descending upon the world in the middle of the day. Elias fell to his knees in the dust. The scroll he had carried, the report he had tried to write, fell from his tunic, and he did not pick it up. It was meaningless now. The verdict was in. The world had judged God and found him guilty of being too good for them. He remembered the parable of the wedding feast. The king had prepared a banquet, but those who were invited refused to come. They killed the messengers. Elias realized he was looking at the ultimate rejection of the invitation. The king had come to his own party, and the guests were murdering him. Tears finally came to Elias, hot and stinging. He was not crying for the man on the cross anymore. He was crying for himself and for Jerusalem. He was crying because he finally understood that the man dying on that hill was not the victim of a tragedy. He was the sacrifice. The shepherd was not just looking for the sheep. He was laying down his life for them, just as he said he would. And the sheep stood by and watched him die. The darkness covered the land, but the darkness in Elias's heart was even deeper. He covered his head with dust and waited for the end of the world. The death of the Nazarene did not bring the silence Elias expected. Instead, it brought a terrifying thunder that seemed to crack the very foundations of the earth. As the sky darkened in the middle of the day, Elias felt the ground beneath him shudder, as if the land itself was groaning in protest. The curtain in the temple, the great barrier between the holy place and the world of men, was reported torn in two from top to bottom. But for Elias, the real tearing had happened in his own chest. He watched from a distance as the crowds dispersed. They beat their chests, the bloodlust of the morning replaced by a heavy, suffocating dread. They had asked for a spectacle, but they had witnessed a slaughter, and the reality of it settled over Jerusalem like a shroud. Elias saw two men approach the cross. One was Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, a man Elias knew well. Joseph had sat in the same meetings, worn the same robes, and maintained the same silence. But now, Joseph was doing something unthinkable. He was going to Pilate. He was asking for the body. He was publicly identifying himself with the executed man. Elias felt a pang of shame so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees. Joseph was the wheat that had survived the choking thorns of fear. Elias was still the chaff, blown about by the wind of public opinion. He watched them lower the body. The teacher looked small now, stripped of the mystery and authority that had commanded the waves and the demons. He was just a broken shell. They carried him to a garden nearby, to a new tomb cut into the rock. Elias followed, staying in the shadows, a spy until the bitter end. He saw them roll a massive stone against the entrance. The sound of the grinding rock was final. It was the sound of a book closing. It was the sound of a prison door locking. Elias turned away. The parable of the sower came back to him. The seed had fallen, but it had not fallen on good soil to grow. It had fallen into a tomb to rot. The hope of a kingdom, of a new way of being human, was sealed behind cold limestone. That evening, the Sabbath began. A silence descended on the city, but it was not the peace of rest. It was the tension of a held breath. Elias sat in his quarters, staring at a flickering oil lamp. The high priest and the Pharisees had gone to Pilate to request a guard for the tomb. They remembered the teacher's words better than his disciples did. "After 3 days I will rise again." They called it a deception. They wanted to ensure the dead stayed dead. Elias thought of the grain of wheat. The teacher had said, "Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed, but if it dies, it produces many seeds." Elias looked at his hands. They were empty. He had spent his life preserving his status, protecting his single seed of reputation. The man in the tomb had spent his life pouring it out, and now he was gone. The logic of the world said Elias had won. He was alive. He was safe. He still had his position. But as the long hours of the Sabbath stretched out, Elias felt like he was the one in the tomb. He was breathing, but his soul was dead. The man behind the stone was dead, but his memory was more alive in that room than Elias himself. The defeat was total. The weeds had choked the wheat. The enemy had won. Elias blew out the lamp and sat in the darkness, waiting for a dawn he did not believe would come. The Sabbath passed with agonizing slowness. Elias avoided the temple. He could not bear to look at the faces of the priests, faces masked in victorious piety while their hands were stained with innocent blood. He stayed in his room, the scrolls of the prophets open before him, but the words swam on the page. Then came the first day of the week. It started with a tremor of panic that ran through the priestly quarters before the sun had fully risen. Elias heard running footsteps in the hallway. He heard hushed, urgent whispers. He opened his door and grabbed the arm of a passing Levite. The young man was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He stammered that the guards had returned from the tomb. They were saying things that made no sense. They spoke of an earthquake, of a blinding light, of the stone being rolled away not by human hands, but by something else. And the tomb was empty. Elias felt a shock of electricity run up his spine. Empty? He dressed quickly and ran to the council chamber. It was already full. The atmosphere was not one of triumph anymore. It was one of desperate damage control. The guards were there, looking shaken, stripped of their arrogance. They were telling a story that defied physics. But the elders were not interested in the truth. They were interested in containment. Elias watched as bags of money were brought out. Heavy bags. They were thrust into the hands of the soldiers. The narrative was crafted right there in front of him. You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. It was a clumsy lie. If the guards were asleep, how did they know who stole the body? And for a Roman soldier to admit sleeping on watch was a death sentence. The priests promised to protect them from the governor. Elias backed away from the table. The corruption was absolute. They were bribing witnesses to cover up a miracle. He slipped out of the room and ran. He ran out of the city gates, toward the garden. He had to see. When he arrived, the sun was bright. The stone was indeed rolled away, sitting off to the side like a discarded toy. Elias stepped into the cool darkness of the sepulchre. It was empty, but it was not the emptiness of a robbery. If thieves had come, they would have taken the body wrapped in the expensive linens and spices, or they would have tossed the wrappings aside in haste. But here, the linen strips were lying by themselves, preserving the shape of the body that had been there, like a cocoon left behind by a butterfly. The cloth that had been around the head was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. It was orderly. It was deliberate. It was peaceful. Elias stood there, his breath catching in his throat. He remembered the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The warning echoed in his mind, louder than ever. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. The Sanhedrin had the proof. They had the empty tomb. They had the testimony of the guards. But they refused to believe. Their hearts, were the hard path where the seed could not penetrate. They were choosing to bribe the truth into silence rather than fall on their knees. But what about Elias? He touched the rough stone of the wall. The body was gone. The prophecy spoke of this. The teacher spoke of this. The sign of Jonah, 3 days in the earth. Doubt still clawed at him. It was impossible. Dead men do not rise. It went against nature. It went against everything his rational mind accepted. But then, everything about this man had gone against nature. He had walked on water. He had fed thousands with a boy's lunch. He had loved the unlovable. Why was the resurrection any harder to believe than the love he had shown to a tax collector? Elias walked out of the tomb, blinking in the sunlight. The world looked the same, but it felt different. The air felt charged with a new energy. If the tomb was empty, then the story was not over. If the tomb was empty, then the seed had not just died, it had broken open. The harvest was beginning. He walked back toward the city, but he did not go to the priests. He went to find the disciples. He needed to know if they were still the cowards who had fled, or if something had happened to them too, because if the king was alive, then the kingdom was unstoppable. 40 days had passed. Jerusalem was swelling again, this time for the Feast of Weeks. The city was a cauldron of languages and nations, but Elias was no longer watching the high priest. He was watching the upper room where the followers of the Nazarene gathered. He had seen them change. That was the greatest miracle. Elias stood at the edge of a crowd near the temple courts. Peter was standing up, the same Peter who had cowered before a servant girl by the fire, the same Peter who had sworn and lied to save his own skin. Now, Peter stood like a lion. His voice boomed across the square, filled with a power that did not belong to a fisherman. He spoke to the very men who had crucified his master. He did not speak with fear. He spoke with authority. He told them that the man they killed was the Lord of life. He told them that death could not hold him. He quoted the Psalms and the prophets, weaving the scriptures together in a way that no scribe, not even Elias, had ever done. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this. God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. The crowd was cut to the heart. Thousands of them cried out, "What shall we do?" Elias watched, stunned. This was the mustard seed. It had been buried in the ground, seemingly dead, but now it had burst forth, and the branches were spreading right before his eyes. 3,000 people were stepping forward to be baptized. The harvest was coming in, not with scythes of judgment, but with water of repentance. Elias looked at the faces of the new believers. He saw Pharisees, he saw priests, he saw tax collectors, he saw Romans. The wheat and the weeds were no longer indistinguishable. The weeds were turning into wheat. The power of the resurrection was not just in an empty tomb. It was in the transformation of the living. Elias felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Levi. The former tax collector was smiling. He did not look like a man who had lost his leader. He looked like a man who had found his eternity. "He is waiting, Elias," Levi said softly. "The Father is still running down the road. The door is still open." Elias looked at the temple, the magnificent structure of stone and gold, the place where he had spent his life trying to earn God's favor. Then he looked at the group of believers breaking bread in the shadow of Solomon's colonnade. They had everything in common. They sold their property to give to anyone who had need. There were no rich, no poor, no Jew, no Gentile. There was only the family of the king. It was the feast of the prodigal son, happening in real life. The fattened calf had been killed. The music was playing. Elias reached into his tunic. He pulled out the stylus he had used to write his reports. He looked at it for a moment, the symbol of his old life, his role as the critic, the observer, the older brother standing outside judging the party. He dropped the stylus into the dust. He took a step toward Levi, then another. The crushing weight of his pride, the heavy armor of his righteousness, seemed to fall away with each stride. He was terrified, yes. He was giving up his status, his income, his reputation. He was joining a sect that the world hated. But he remembered the merchant who found a pearl of great price. The merchant sold everything he had to buy it. Elias finally understood. It was not a sacrifice, it was a bargain. He reached the group. Peter stopped speaking and looked at him. There was no suspicion in Peter's eyes, only the same welcome the Master had shown. Elias fell to his knees, not in the temple, but on the dusty stones of the street. He did not recite his genealogy. He did not list his fasting or his tithing. He closed his eyes, and the image of the tax collector in the temple filled his mind. He opened his mouth and spoke the only words that mattered, the words that opened the gates of the kingdom. "Lord," Elias whispered, his voice breaking, "have mercy on me, a sinner." A hand rested on his head, then another, then another. He was surrounded by fishermen, zealots, and sinners. He felt arms lifting him up. He was no longer the spy. He was no longer the older brother. He was home. The mustard seed had grown. The lost sheep was found. And in the heart of Elias, the dusty ground of Galilee finally brought forth a harvest that would last forever.